Well, good morning. The Human First Protocol. The Crisis in Learning, Part 1. We live in a time of unprecedented technological power and educational failure. Billions are spent on education, yet literacy is declining. Emotional regulation, critical thinking, and a love for learning are absent from our classrooms. Meanwhile, the systems claiming to serve us are designed without us in mind, automated, digitized, and dehumanized. This protocol is born from necessity, a way to reclaim learning for real people with real needs. Part 2, a framework rooted in humanity. So the Human First Protocol isn't just an educational theory. It's a method, a philosophy, and a way of life. It draws on science, lived experience, trauma-informed care, and classic wisdom. It integrates audiobooks, physical books, visual memory, tools, mindfulness practices, and trauma-aware approaches to create a full-spectrum method for helping anyone learn better. It acknowledges what researchers like Marianne Wolf have pointed out. We are born storytellers, but not born readers. We must be taught to read, but we already know how to listen and imagine. Rather than ignore this reality, we should use it. We should leverage storytelling, audio, and inner visualization to bridge gaps in literacy and comprehension, and more importantly, engagement. We need to get our kids and our adults excited about learning again. This works not just for children, but, as I said, for adults, especially those navigating trauma, learning disabilities, or re-entry into education. So I argue that could be 80% of the population. This approach is inclusive by design, avoiding the trap of one-size-fits-all education. The Human First Protocol helps slow learners become joyful learners, and fast learners become deep thinkers. Now, what I mean by that is I took that from a recent study that said that slow learners, when they're young, end up, it was actually slow readers, end up not liking reading when they grow up. So I argue people who found the normal education system a struggle will themselves be the same. They will find it difficult to get excited about learning something new. I saw this in the bank. I love to learn new things, but most of the people I worked with hated taking courses. I said this before, that I used to get a lot of my really good books from fellow kids in college, university, because they weren't reading the books. So I could just, borrow their books from different classes. That's how I fell in love with Heart of Darkness, right? My friend was taking it in a class, an advanced class. They were a little ahead of me. I got knocked back a year or so because of my undiagnosed learning disability at the time. So most of my friends were about a year ahead of me. And I was a big fan of Apocalypse Now. And so when he had that Heart of Darkness book, I was like, yeah, I'm going to give it a go. And it's not a very big book, but it took me a while. But that's accomplishment, right? Deep thinkers, right? Joyful learners. It's a passion about the work. So that's why I read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, is because I had the passion already, right? And it deepened the story that I already loved. So part 3. I apologize for the digression. Part 3, the path forward. This is a protocol designed for autodidacts who want to learn with speed, integrity, and depth, but I argue it'll also encourage people to learn to be self-directed learners. Parents looking to support their children's learning without coercion, but honestly, it will also help parents learn this material, because how can you teach it if you don't understand it? Educators and coaches tired of ineffective models and hungry for something rooted in both science and soul. What I mean by that, it's 20, 30 years that we've been seeing declining reading and literacy. I argue that there's never been a time that we're so literate, but at the same time, so few of us are fluent, right? And so children and adults recovering from trauma or burnout who need a gentle re-entry into learning, I would say that's anybody with trauma, anybody that had, there's also, developmental trauma. So that means say if when you were in grade school, your parents were having a divorce, well, you might have missed out on a bunch of foundational educational periods, which will continue to cause you trouble. And that's where maybe some of these slow learners came from, is because they got sick, or a family member got sick, or they lost a family member, or divorce, or a brother. Like, think about it nowadays. How many families are being broken apart by overdose death and, family members passing away? Any of these traumas can cause us to have a level of developmental trauma and therefore disability compared to most. And that will never heal itself, right? I'm talking about even the pandemic, all of those kids that were, left behind. If we don't do something immediately, those children will grow up to be adults that will find it difficult to learn and stay up to date on some things. So here's my key components of the path forward. Learn to listen again. Start with audiobooks, pair them with physical books or ebooks. Follow along. Let your brain rewire through rhythm and narrative. Train visual memory. Use visualization techniques to see words in your mind on a whiteboard, in the sky, or written in light. This builds fluency without forcing traditional reading drills. Now, what I mean by that is a lot of people talk about how they find it difficult to focus on audiobooks. Well, you don't have much to focus on except just the one input, right? The audio. But a physical book, right? You got the paper, the feel of the paper, the color of the paper, the font, size, shape. So you got your visual cues, and you're also, there's other cues. People talk about the smell of the paper and the sound of the pages turning. And that is a thing, because if you look at digital apps for reading, they actually put in the page flipping sound, right? So this is about training yourself to focus as we once did with our children, but this time for audiobooks. And I'm surprised, because I'll have people tell me they can't focus on audiobooks, yet they'll listen to long-form podcasts. So the question then is, are they actually listening to the long-form podcasts, or are they, drifting off? Because a really well-known educator claimed that he has to force himself to read for an hour a day, and he has to break that up into 2 half-hour segments, because he can't go longer than that without checking his phone. Imagine, I've talked about this. Jonathan Haidt was wrong. It's not taking away the phone, because there you go, even adults can't do that. They can't take it away. All they do is pine away for the phone. We need to change the relationship we have. And in this case, I'm talking about education, but that's also technology. My idea for a meta-modern education reform includes old and new. Whatever may guide us, whatever serves us, is what we will go with, right? So that's what I mean by training visual memory. It's focus. It's also developing your ability to think in your mind, right? Something's happened in the last 20, 30 years. There was a time when we used to test people's ability to visualize in their mind, right? Manipulate objects in the mind. And that was fairly advanced cognitive function in the sense that, artists and archetypes were usually those with that sort of skill. But fast forward to today, we have so many passive visuals that we can bring up in our minds, right? Because of our videos and our YouTubes and our movies and all of the media. I think this is what's hidden a decline in overall cognitive IQ scores, is because we've been able to fudge some of the areas. So these people aren't visualizing. They're remembering visuals that they passively accepted, right? So I'm arguing a return to the imagination. Right? What allows us to define our world and predict into the world, to create our presence and our present, something that will lead into the future. We do that by designing our mythos. Our mythos is narrative. Narrative is storytelling. Storytelling is imagination, experience, education, and something more. And if we're missing any of those little pieces, if we don't believe there's something beyond ourselves, even William James, the psychiatrist, admitted in the end, in his radical empiricism, that there has to be something more than ourselves, more than even our own personal consciousness. There has to be an external consciousness. I do believe this is what inspired Jung and his collective unconscious, is this idea that we need to tap into something more, something meta. But, as I said, it's not just education, but it's educating the mind so that it can imagine and it can solve problems. I've always said we teach our kids to do algebra, not so they'll be algebraists when they grow up, but because it improves the minor folds of the brain, right? Conquering one difficult task makes the next all that much more easy to conquer, right? And we used to think it was confidence, but it's not. It's that brain function, as it were, improves over time. Which is why the next step is practice. But in this case, practice emotional regulation, right? Learning breathing techniques, that helps with your cognition and your focus. Journaling helps with trauma and your focus. And also, in a sense, it's kind of like a commonplace book. By offloading some of these things from your active cognition, it allows you to have more room to work on higher order tasks. Or just simple mindfulness tools, right? Mindfulness can be a great way to develop focus and calmness. This stabilizes the nervous system and makes learning safe again. What I've talked about is the developmental trauma, this idea if a kid is sitting in school and they're nervous about their next meal, or they're nervous about going home because they might get beat, well, there you go. They're not going to learn properly. Next would be respect the learning curve. Slower learners often become the deepest thinkers if they're not shamed out of learning. Fast learners often burn out unless they're taught deeply. So the example I give is the experiment where they took two groups of people and they asked them to memorize a piece of dialogue, or I can't remember exactly what it was. And one group was allowed to try and then fail, meaning quickly try to memorize as much as you can and then try to repeat it back. And if you fail, go back and try again to read and then, right, trying and failing, right, with the goal of improvement, right, iteration, right. It's very similar to technology nowadays, what they call it, rapid prototyping. And the other group was allowed to take all the time they wanted to make them feel like they had memorized the piece. Now, here's the real takeaway. Weeks later, the group that tried and failed retained more information, much more information than the group that just wholesale tried to memorize it all. Right? This is this idea of, well, really engaging with the material deeply. Right? And 6, design learning spaces that work. So accessibility is non-negotiable. Apps must include visual options, font changes, lighting preferences, and audio syncing. Every learning environment should recognize cognitive load, not increase it. Right? I was talking to a programmer and I asked him simply, I said, do you guys consider accessibility? And he brought up, well, we have a whole department that's called user experience. I said, no, that's not accessibility. And so I said, well, you're missing out on a huge portion of your audience. What % of the population do you think are diagnosed dyslexic? This programmer came back to me and said, 1%? Oh, no, it's 20%. And when you take in all of the different, learning issues that people might have, right? Either developmental trauma itself, learning disabilities, perceptual issues, eyeglasses, Irlen syndrome, you name it, right? When you take all that into account, these accessibility options, a change of font, a change in color on the screen, maybe where it will read out instructions for you. All of those would probably help 60 to 80% of the population, not just 20, right? And 7, use open protocols and open source tools. This movement isn't a product to sell. That's what's wrong with so many therapies and so many modalities. They will try to patent a very, 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 very small little niche, right? I told you before, there's this guy who tries to say that we need to have our kids, our dyslexic or learning challenged kids, to sculpt words out of clay. If they sculpt the words out of clay, then they'll have meaning. But as a dyslexic, I can tell you that's not going to work, right? Because I can remember quotes from 100 different books, but to remember somebody's name, that to me is an incredible challenge, because there's no thought behind it, right? Like, for example, I ran into one guy, and this is how I was able to keep it. His name is Mike. So I just pictured a microphone. And I still remember his name. But somebody like Fred, well, honestly, for me, what I would do is I would think of Breakfast at Tiffany's. That's the character. In one of the characters in the movie was Fred. Right? Things like that. Right? So those are my protocols. So unlike that teacher who I don't think really was dyslexic, but he thought he was curing dyslexics because he read about theories, I've actually lived it. I've talked about this. Same as mindfulness. Mindfulness has saved my life, but not the way it's taught in the West. Actual mindfulness and meditation or contemplation, the way it's meant to be done. So I had to go and learn it myself, because here in the West, they teach strictly insight meditation. But I'm sorry, this trauma-informed world is forgetting that the first step is calm abiding meditation. Because how can you use insight until you're calm? Just an utter failure in the West here, right? So my conclusion is this. This is not school. This is reclamation. You don't need permission to learn. You don't need certification to care. You don't need to wait for a system that has already failed you. You can begin today. This human first protocol is a living framework. It will evolve, but its heart remains constant. Put the human back at the center of learning. So there you go. So that's my human focused, right? So I did a short 2-minute. I'll put it here at the end in case anyone's interested. I did a shorter little dialogue that was trying to explain this here, right? So what if the problem isn't the learner, but the system? Today, millions of children and adults are being left behind, not because they lack intelligence, but because education has forgotten what it means to be human. The Human First Protocol is a new framework for learning, one that adapts to you. Based on the science of language, memory, and emotional regulation, this protocol helps people read better, think faster, and stay engaged by using how the brain naturally learns. It's not just for kids, it's for adults, autodidacts, and anyone who's ever felt like traditional education wasn't made for them. Remember, Einstein failed utterly in his home country, and a more open and a fluid style of education in Switzerland allowed him to become one of our greatest minds. So the Human First Protocol puts the human, not the institution, at the center of education, not unlike the Swiss model at the time. Because learning isn't just about information, it's about transformation. So remember that, right? Our goal in learning is, I'll give you one of my favorite Greek words, metempsychosis. It's the change of state of the self. As Hemingway said, it's only honorable to be better than your previous self. It is never honorable to be better than anyone else, right? The sixth line of the Isha Upanishad, the secret to ending hurt, to ending suffering, is to see the self in other and to see the other in oneself. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you for your time. And you can get a hold of me online, give me a subscribe and all that jazz. But I would love dialogue and questions, interactions, even suggestions for like what you would be interested in me talking about. I have shifted a little bit in time because, as I've said, what I've realized is the love of Buddhism, I think, is sourced in a need for trauma healing. So this is why my focus seems a little bifurcated, but have a great day.